INCOTERMs are terms and rules created by the International Chamber of Commerce, which are accepted and recognized internationally, which strictly determine the rights and obligations of both the selling party and the buying party, as well as clearly establish the moment of transfer of the costs and risks on fuel from the seller to the buyer. Furthermore, the INCOTERMs they also determine the agreed price of the fuel, the place of delivery of the product, who is in charge or responsible for contracting and paying for transportation and storage, establishes the moment of transfer of costs and risks from the seller to the buyer, the documents that each party must process and their cost, and who is responsible for contracting and paying for fuel insurance. There are 11 types of INCOTERM, which they state clearly the obligations and responsibilities for the seller and the buyer in each of the steps in the fuel purchase and sale process. This INCOTERMs are: Ex Works, Free Carrier, Free Alongside Ship, Free On Board, Cost and Freight, Cost, Insurance and Freight, Carrier Paid To, Carrier and Insurance Paid To, Deliver at Terminal, Deliver at Place, Deliver Duty Paid. We can classify these INCOTERM into 4 groups. Group E, Group F, Group C, Group D. In the EX Works INCOTERM, the only one in Group E, the selling party delivers the fuel to its facilities in the country of origin where the fuel was produced. In this INCOTERM EX Works, the seller's responsibilities are only to invoice the product, to receive payment and deliver the product with its ownership titles and the necessary documentation for its export by the buyer. And the buyer's responsibilities are to pay for the fuel, take care of transportation or injection in the country of origin, to be able to load or store the fuel in its international maritime freight, as well as take care of all departure expenses, both port and export costs, and merchandise insurance. The buyer will also be responsible for all arrival expenses in the country or port of destination of the fuel, for all import costs and taxes, and for the injection and storage process at the destination port until its final destination. In this INCOTERM EX Works, the only responsibility of the seller is the delivery of the fuel already paid to the buyer, and the buyer is responsible for all costs both in the process of leaving the fuel in the country of origin as well as for all costs in the process of arrival and receipt of fuel. Upon arrival of the ship at the destination port, the buyer must cover the costs and maneuvers of docking the ship, the injection processes to unload the ship into its storage tank or final transportation, and cover the import costs and taxes. Group F of INCOTERMs includes Free Carrier, where the seller loads the internal transport at the port of origin so that the buyer can transport it at his own cost and risk to the port. Free Along Ship, where the seller is responsible for hiring internal transportation and moving it to the port and placing it in the port so that the buyer can proceed to load his boat with fuel at his own cost and risk. Free On Board. In this INCOTERM, the seller is responsible for transferring the fuel to the port of origin, covering the costs of export and departure in the country of origin, and injecting or loading the fuel into the vessel or storage contracted and paid for by the buyer. In the INCOTERM FOB, the seller is responsible for the delivering of the fuel into the buyer's storage tanks or vessel. The seller must also cover all costs associated with this duties, including the terminal handling charges, export clearance costs, and security requirements. With FOB INCOTERMs, the risk and cost of the process are transferred from the seller to the buyer as soon the process of injection into buyer's tanks or vessel begins. The buyer is responsible for all costs associated with the reception of the fuel into his tanks or vessel, including injection cost, port, receipt, custom, importation, tax, and demurrage costs. In the FOB process, the seller's obligation is to inject the fuel into the buyer's storage tanks. And the buyer's responsibility is to present all logistics, whether tanks or vessels, fully activated and paid with their corresponding documentation. The seller in the FOB process will present the commercial invoice and the partial proof of product, PPOP, documents of the fuel to the buyer, also issuing the necessary documents to be signed and endorsed by the buyer's storage and logistics company, such as the injection program agreement or tank-to-tank or vessel injection agreement to immediately begin the fuel injection process into the buyer's tanks or vessel. To proceed with the injection of fuel into the buyer's tanks, the buyer's storage and logistics company must sign and endorse all authorizations for the injection process, the injection program agreement, notices of readiness, and the schedule of injection, as well as prepare the tanks, clean them, decontaminate them, and coordinate with the injection company and the port authority to have all the relevant codes and authorizations to proceed with the start of the injection process. In order for the storage logistics company to sign, endorse, and proceed with all authorizations for the injection process, the buyer must have made all necessary payments for the rental of the necessary tank days required by the injection company, as well as such as payment of all pre-injection and injection codes, and having paid the fees of the injection company and the fees for the authorization of the port authority. Everything has to be covered and paid for, and all documents have been delivered to the seller so that he can proceed with the start of the injection process into the buyer's storage tanks. It is important that the buyer knows that when the injection of the product into the buyer's tanks begins, all risk and cost is transferred from the seller to the buyer until the completion of the project, the payment of the fuel, and the delivery of the ownership titles and other relevant export documents. Likewise, the import process, taxes, and any license required by the port authorities are also completely the responsibility of the buyer. Once the injection process has finished, the post-injection process comes, where the injection company disconnects hoses, ducts, valves, and prepares the injection report, IR, which is sent directly from the injection company to the port authority to be attached to the final POP documents. Once the post-injection expenses have been covered and the post-injection and authorization codes have been paid for the entry of the inspection company to carry out the sampling of the tanks for the quality and quantity report, such as the entry port certificate code, EPC, and badge number code, then the quality and quantity report is generated by the certifying company and is also sent to the port authority to be annexed to the full POP. Once the port authority has received all the documents from the injection company, the injection report and the quality and quantity report from the certifying company, the port authority gives the authorization to seal the tanks to the federal authorities of the port, thus no one can touch the product until the end of the transaction. Once the port authority has received and is in possession of all POP documents, injection report, seller's TSR, quality and quantity report, certificate of origin, export documents from the country of origin of the fuel, verify that all post-injection and post-verification costs of the product have been covered by the buyer, as well as the port security codes such as the International Security Port Service, ISPS code, and the International Maritime Dangerous Goods, IMDG code, which the buyer complies with their licenses or permits for the marketing of fuels and has covered all import processes and taxes, and there is no debt. At that time the full POP and SGS documents are released to the buyer by the port authorities, so that the buyer can verify, pay the fuel to the seller and have their ownership and export titles for the fuel delivered. The FOB INCOTERM is one of the most requested by buyers, but unfortunately it is the most complicated for us sellers, due to the lack of correct knowledge and management of costs and responsibilities on the part of buyers. This FOB INCOTERM requires a buyer with great knowledge and logistics, in the management of injection processes, the rules of the different international ports, and above all, it requires a buyer with the economic and financial capacity not to interrupt the operation, and can complete the FOB process, because if it is not completed, the consequences of penalties and delays are of great legal and economic cost, especially for the purchasing party. This responsibility in logistics, injection, import and taxes for the buyer also becomes the greatest advantage in the FOB process for the buyer, because by having control and responsibility for these costs the buyer can optimize them and in this way have the best price when purchasing fuel. In Group 3, we have the INCOTERMs identified with the letter C, in which the selling party is responsible for all the costs and risks of the fuel, also including the means of transportation. In this Group C, there are 4 INCOTERMs: cost and freight. The seller delivers the fuel injected into the vessel contracted and paid for by the seller. Cost, insurance and freight, where the seller is responsible for the costs of loading the ship, the cost of freight and insurance in favor of the buyer until arrival at the destination port. Carrier, paid to. The seller is responsible until the merchandise reaches the destination determined by the buyer. Carrier, and insurance, paid to. The seller is responsible for the cost of transportation and insurance in favor of the buyer until the fuel reaches its final destination. In the INCOTERM of Group C, they are responsibility of the seller: hire the vessel, pay the costs of the injection processes to carry out the loading the vessel with fuel, as well cover all port and export costs to allow departure of the vessel to the destination port determined by the buyer. Likewise, the seller is responsible for contracting the insurance coverage of the vessel and fuel against the risk of loss or damage from departure until arrival at the destination port. The seller transfers the fuel risk to the buyer once the fuel has been injected and the vessel has been fully loaded, but the cost is transferred from the seller to the buyer until the vessel has arrived and docked at the port of discharge determined by the buyer. The only requirement is that the buyer must place a financial instrument as a payment guarantee type SBLC MT 760 to ensure payment of the fuel once received to the complete satisfaction of the buyer. This CIF INCOTERM is highly recommended to initiate fuel transactions between 2 companies that are going to carry out a transaction for first time, because both seller and buyer are protected by the SBLC financial instrument on the part of the buyer and for the performance bond or performance guarantee on the part of the seller. In the INCOTERMs of Group D, the selling party is responsible for all the costs of transporting the fuel as well as for all the risks that the fuel could suffer in its quality and quantity in its transport from the loading port to the arrival of the fuel to the port or place of discharge or destination determined by the buyer. Within this group is INCOTERM Deliver at Place or DAP. In this INCOTERM DAP, the seller is responsible for delivering the fuel to the port or place designated by the buyer. The buyer is responsible for the process and cost of import, taxes, and unloading of the fuel in its storage or final transportation. In the INCOTERM Deliver at Place Unloaded DPU, in this INCOTERM the seller, apart from transporting and delivering the fuel at the port or place designated by the buyer, is also responsible for the unloading of the fuel, and the risk is transferred to the buyer once the fuel is unloaded or injected into the buyer's storage or transportation. In the INCOTERM Delivered Duty Paid DDP, the seller, apart from the transportation and risk of the fuel until its final delivery or unloading in the buyer's final storage or transportation, must also include the cost and fee of the import process and taxes. This INCOTERM DDP places maximum responsibility and risk on the seller. The most important thing in the purchase of fuels is that the buyer selects or chooses the INCOTERM most appropriate to its logistical and financial capacity so that it can complete and comply in a timely manner with the different steps of the INCOTERM processes selected by the buyer, and in this way can to complete the transaction satisfactorily for both the buyer and the seller. As we have commented, the FOB process is the most complicated and difficult for us, the selling party, first due to the lack of understanding or knowledge on the part of the buyer, second because it is the process where the most variables can occur outside the control of the selling party and the buying party. Therefore, in this FOB INCOTERM, a buyer with extensive knowledge and logistics is required. With a storage company of his complete and total confidence, the buyer must have extensive knowledge of the injection processes, the regulations of the port selected by the buyer where he will receive his fuel. The buyer must have sufficient and expeditious financial capacity to pay each requirement of his storage company, the injection company, the codes and requirements determined by the authorities of the port, as well as the payment of the costs of the team of inspectors or certifying company to carry out the sampling to verify the quality and quantity of the product. It must also have all the relevant licenses required by federal and state authorities for the marketing, transportation, and storage of fuels, and have insurance coverage in case of any contingency. It is also important that the buyer knows that any delay in any of the steps may result in increased costs due to delays or penalties. It must be remembered that in the INCOTERM FOB, the responsibility of the seller is only to start the process of injecting the fuel into the tanks, and logistics paid and activated by the buyer. At the moment the injection begins, all costs and risks are borne in full. Buyer's total account and responsibility. Many of the FOB projects fail due to the lack of knowledge of these responsibilities on the part of the buyer of the different steps and costs of the INCOTERM FOB process. Whereas the costs increase as the FOB project advances, the buyer truncates the due process, especially due to the financial inability to cover the costs of injection, post-injection, inspection, verification, port costs, fuel payment, import, and taxes. Therefore, in the FOB INCOTERM, the buyer must be completely sure that he has the logistical and financial capacity to complete and finish the FOB processes. If the buyer is not sure, does not have experience in logistics, or does not have financial capacity, it is better to choose another type of INCOTERM more suitable for the buyer. On the contrary, in the CIF and DAP processes, most of the cost and risk responsibilities rest with the selling party, providing greater security to the buyer because before any cost or risk transmission, it is possible to verify the POP product and SGS quality and quantity before any payment or cost of logistics by the buyer. The only requirement for the buyer is to place a standard bank letter of credit SBLC type financial guarantee to guarantee the transaction, and in this way, the seller can take care of most of the cost and risk of delivering the fuel to the buyer and allow its verification before of any payment or cost to the buyer. We hope that this summary of the 11 existing INCOTERMs in international fuel transactions has been helpful in their correct understanding and helps buyers choose the correct INCOTERM for their transaction, depending on their logistical and financial capacity. For inexperienced buyers or those with little logistical capacity, the safest INCOTERM is the INCOTERM Cost Insurance and Freight CIF. It is very important to point out because it is a priority that the buyer chooses the most appropriate INCOTERM for his transaction, because the INCOTERM that the buyer chooses will determine his responsibilities, costs, risks, and will also determine the purchase price of the fuel. These INCOTERMs are applicable and can be used in any safe port in the world where there is infrastructure for storage, transportation, injection, and fuel verification. We appreciate your attention to this brief summary, trying to facilitate communication with our potential buyers and to help you decide the best INCOTERM for the fuel purchase and sale operation. We hope it has been of help to you, and we are here to attend to your fuel purchase orders. for which we will try to be the most flexible and help a successful transaction with all our capacity. Thank you so much.